Hey everybody, Deathblade here. I'm coming at you with a Yin Yang China video, which is a video in which I talk about...
Did I hit the start button?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah. Hey everybody, Deathblade here with another Yin Yang China, where I talk about the ups and downs of living in China as an expat and to some extent traveling there as well. I lived in China for 8 years, as many of you know, and I only just recently moved back to the United States with my family. So all of these contrasting differences are still very fresh in mind. Today I'm going to be talking about restaurants. Now, before I get started, I want to point out that I'm not talking about Chinese food. Chinese food is a really big topic. I touched on it in my video about why I left China after 8 years. Chinese food is amazing. I mean, I can't say enough good things about it. I have so many Chinese dishes that I love. Outside of China, it's hard to get really authentic Chinese food. It doesn't matter if you go to a Chinatown, for example, if you're talking about the United States. I've been to Chinatowns in San Francisco, in LA, in San Diego, in New York City. New York has a couple different Chinatowns. And it is true that you can get some pretty authentic stuff, but compared to what you can get in China, it's just not on the same level. I'm not talking about the food, I'm specifically talking about the restaurant experience. Now, again, I gotta point out, you can't lump all of the restaurants in China together into one small description. There's going to be differences between a roadside street vendor who has some folding chairs and folding tables set up and some fancy schmancy restaurant that serves really expensive food. And of course the location is going to be different. Restaurants in Beijing are going to be different than Shanghai and Guangzhou, and that's not to mention that those are the big cities. Outside of the big cities, things can be different. That said, I have traveled extensively throughout China. I've been to many cities, many different provinces. I've eaten at fancy restaurants, I've eaten at street food places, I've eaten all over the place. And so what I'm going to do in this video is just kind of condense the general basics down into a few elements that you're going to find at most Chinese restaurants, whether it's expensive or not expensive, whether you're in Beijing or whether you're in some village somewhere. There tend to be some kind of common themes. So the whole reason I started out doing these videos, and the reason why I call it yin and yang, is because I wanted to talk about the upsides, the downsides, the good sides, and the bad sides. It's very easy to, you go on YouTube, you can find plenty of videos where there's expats talking about how horrible China is for whatever reason. And you can also find a lot of videos where people are like described in glowing terms. I'm trying to get a balance between them so that you, as somebody who maybe is considering moving there or traveling there, or maybe just somebody who's interested in it, can kind of hear from the perspective of a foreigner who was there for a long time and kind of became entrenched in the culture and the life there. So let's get started. What are some of the good things about Chinese restaurants that are different from restaurants overseas, specifically in the United States and Western countries? Well, one of the first one that comes to mind is there is no assigned waiter to your table almost ever in a Chinese restaurant. Now that comes with some bad sides that I'm going to talk about when I get to the bad sides. But on the good side, it makes it so that you can literally call on anyone you see to provide you service. You don't have to wait for your assigned waiter that takes your order and waits on you. You don't have to wait for that person to come around to get finished talking to those people over there. You can get help, you can get service from anybody, and that is an upside that I really appreciate, because sometimes here in the United States, it comes to mind just a couple of days ago, we went out to dinner and we were basically done, we wanted our check, and I saw way off in the other corner of the restaurant, our waiter went out onto the balcony area to take care of some tables out there, and it was really frustrating. We're sitting there waiting. I know if it's an emergency, you can, or if you're really anxious, you can always, flag somebody down. But it's I think expected in most Western restaurants, sit-down restaurants, that you're gonna wait for your assigned server. Not so in China. In fact, when it comes to getting the attention of your server, your waiter, your waitress, another thing that's really common in China is just to call out to them. Now, in Western countries, at least in the United States, in my experience, usually you don't like yell out to your waiter across the restaurant. You kind of try to get their attention, make eye contact, wait for them to walk close enough. But in Chinese, you can literally just call out 服务员. And then they'll come over. And again, you don't want to be yelling at the top of your lungs. That's going to kind of be pushing the boundaries, but calling out across the restaurant, depending on the atmosphere and the type of restaurant, is really common and expected everywhere in China. Another nice thing about restaurants is that there are very few places which don't allow you to bring your own beverages in. It's really common for people to bring their own beverages, whether that's alcohol or whether that's fruit or whatever. The restaurants usually do sell that, but they don't care if you bring your own. They usually don't have any kind of corking fee. So that makes it really nice to be able to bring your own beverages to restaurants. Again, most of them do have the beverages, but it's nice to not have to worry about that kind of thing. Another thing that's kind of nice about Chinese restaurants is the receipt situation. Now this was really weird for me when I first got to China. I didn't understand it. Basically, there are two kind of receipts. One of them is called xiao piao and one of them is called fa piao. That's how I usually heard it referred to. The xiao piao is basically like the actual ticket that comes out of the card machine, which usually people pay by card or by WeChat or something. And that's in English, I think we would refer to that as a receipt, but that's different. The fa piao is the official, like formal receipt that they will keep for bookkeeping purposes. And my understanding, I never did any research into this and never asked around because I never really thought to. I just had heard everybody, all the Chinese people tell me that basically if the restaurant doesn't write you a receipt, then it's easy for them to not report that to the authorities when they pay their taxes. So the restaurants actually prefer to not give you a receipt, and a lot of them will actually incentivize you to not ask for a receipt by providing you with a gift if you don't. So it's usually not anything amazing. It could be like a can of soda or like a box of napkins. You have to usually buy napkins at the restaurants usually. So it's kind of cool to be able to get a little extra gift for nothing. And those official receipts are usually not really good for much of anything. So there's really no reason to get them unless you need them for your own business purposes. Finally, I asked my wife, Madam Deathblade, so she's Chinese, born and raised in China. And she has visited in the United States before we ended up moving here. So she kind of has a similar perspective to mine of living in another country as an expat. And I asked her, I was like, what are the good things about Chinese restaurants in China compared to here? And the first thing she said was
Chinese food.
I was like, okay, I know. Other than Chinese food, is there anything?
And she was like,
There's no social attack.
I was like,
What? What do you mean?
she was like,
Well, in America, you'll have to talk to the waiter and joke with them and be friendly, and sometimes it's really annoying. You just want to get your food.
so that kind of goes back to the assigned waiter thing that I was talking about. From her perspective, although she really appreciates the friendly waiters, sometimes it's nice to go into a restaurant in China, you just sit down, you order your food, and you don't have to worry about engaging socially with the waiters. All right, so those are some of the good things. Now I'm going to get into the bad things. Again, this is not intended to be some kind of exhaustive introduction to Chinese restaurants, and I do have to also point out there are a lot of things about the two different restaurant experiences that are just plain different, and I don't think there's any need to say which is better or worse. Obviously, Western restaurants are going to have forks and knives. Chinese restaurants have chopsticks. In Western restaurants, you're going to have salt and pepper at the side of the table. Chinese restaurants, you're going to have vinegar, and then maybe sometimes some kind of spicy condiment. In Western restaurants, you're going to get ice water. Chinese restaurants, no ice water. You're going to get hot water or maybe tea, and unless it's a nice restaurant, it's not going to be like tea. I know a lot of foreigners have this, perception of China that it's all about drinking tea, and don't get me wrong, there is a lot of tea, but when you go to a restaurant to get tea, it's usually like a pot of water with like one tea leaf in it. It doesn't even have any flavor. Anyway, so those are just differences. I'm now going to get into things which I think are very, very heavily weigh in on the negative side of eating at restaurants in China. Number one thing, they do not have any system to, what's it called in English? Sorry, I'm actually a really huge fan of cooking shows like MasterChef, Top Chef, and there is a term that I'm looking for, and I just cannot, it's not coming to the tip of my tongue, but there's the style of service you get in Western restaurants is usually that you place your order and they begin preparing your order at different times in the back so that it all comes out at the same time, or at least your appetizers usually come out first, then most of the food is supposed to come out at the same time. In China, they have absolutely nothing like that. Food comes out randomly whenever it's ready. Sometimes it'll all come out at once. Sometimes you'll order something and what you intend to be the dessert will come out first and your main course will come out 20 minutes later. Sometimes it's the opposite. Just randomly you'll place the order and for whatever reason, 2 minutes later a dish comes out, then you wait 10 minutes, another dish comes out. It's like that in almost every single restaurant, even the really nice restaurants and even the Western restaurants. So unfortunately, when you go to a Western restaurant, you usually tend to order food for yourself most of the time. Chinese, it's usually the opposite. There's usually, you eat family style, so it's a little bit better when you're eating family style because oh my God. I don't know if you guys can hear this because I'm not sure if the mic is picking it up, but the trash truck has come and it's going down the alley getting all the trash and it's like banging and oh my God, should I just wait till this is over? All right, I'm gonna take a 2-minute break while the trash truck getting the trash. I'll be back in 1 minute. Okay, the trash truck has successfully proceeded on to the next street. So I was talking about how the dishes come out at any time. In Chinese restaurants, it's family style, so that's kind of fine. You know, everybody can kind of pick at the dishes. But when you go to a Western restaurant, I order a hamburger, you order spaghetti. Your spaghetti will come out 10 minutes later, my hamburger will come out. It's kind of annoying, you know, one person will either be forced to wait till their food gets cold to eat together, or one person eats, then the other person eats. That's just how Chinese restaurants work. Now, going back to the no assigned waiter thing, there are some upsides to that. There are obvious downsides that you can imagine just from thinking about it. Since there's nobody specifically taking care of you, it's very easy for things to slip through the cracks. If you tell this one waiter, hey, I want another dish, and then they forget, it's gone, and then you might not even see them again because they're on a different side of the restaurant. So there are a lot of downsides to the no assigned waiter thing. I actually think the no assigned waiter thing, if you're gonna weigh the ups and downs of that specifically, it comes out on the negative side. I actually really don't like that. Another really big downside is the cleanliness issue. Although China does have a system to rate restaurants based on their cleanliness, I am unconvinced that it is particularly useful or objective. One of the big problems in China is corruption and relationships are more important than the law usually. And so I'm unconvinced that the food inspectors actually really do anything. I'm pretty sure that your relationships and the palms that you grease are probably more important in your being able to get that certificate than any actual inspection regarding the cleanliness. And I think the cleanliness is, let's just put it this way. I always felt more comfortable going to McDonald's and it being more healthy than going to the average Chinese restaurant, just because I could see into the back of the McDonald's kitchen and can see them making the food and can see them cleaning and stuff. You don't know what's going on behind the doors in 99% of the Chinese restaurants. You don't know what ingredients are going into the food. Don't get me wrong, there have been some scandals with KFC and McDonald's over the years, but the general food scandals in China are horrible. Fake ingredients and fake oil getting used, and that's not to mention you don't know how they're washing the dishes. They have often served the eating utensils and stuff in a sealed plastic container, which gives you the impression that it's been well washed. I'm not convinced about that. And that's not to mention just the general restaurant environment. There's a lot of behavior in China which I think would be considered uncivilized in the West, and many Chinese people also feel the same. For example, spitting. I have seen people spitting in restaurants. I'm fairly certain I remember even extended family members leaning over and spitting onto the ground at the side of the table and being considered not offensive. I think that sort of behavior is more and more being looked down upon by Chinese people in general, but that said, it still exists. When you're dealing, especially with outward eating environments, it's common to just throw trash onto the ground. Sometimes they'll have a little trash can next to the table, sometimes not, but people will just throw stuff onto the ground and then just leave it there to get swept up by whoever, the restaurant staff or whoever it is. Another thing about Chinese restaurants, and this is more of a Chinese culture thing, but it's part of the restaurant experience, and that is that in Western culture, it's generally frowned upon to take food out of your mouth after putting it in there, like to spit it out or to take it out with your fingers. Not so in Chinese culture. Whether you're eating crab or fish or whatever, it's really common to put stuff in your mouth and then spit something back out. They'll put it onto the table. When you're peeling foods like shrimp or whatever, it's not uncommon for people to put it on the table. You're lucky if it's on the table and not on the ground, like I mentioned a moment before. So that kind of tends to make the restaurant environment less upscale, whether you're talking about a nice restaurant or not. For the average Westerner, it's sometimes kind of off-putting to see that. Chinese people have odd views about children, which I have mentioned in a couple different videos. Again, the video where I talk about leaving China. And it shows in restaurants, a lot of times the parents really just don't care what their kids do. Whether that means the kids are running around on the booths and staring at you and coming up to you while you're trying to eat or talk, or they're just literally running around the restaurant playing tag or something. I've seen that too many times to count. There was one time when I was really kind of excited for me and Madame Deathblade to go out and have a date dinner. And there were 3 kids who actually were my students. They were in, I would say, age 5 or 6, and their parents were just letting them run around, and they were coming around playing peekaboo with me, sort of. And at first it was kind of cute. I was like, hi. And then it just kind of got really annoying because I'm trying to have a dinner and they're coming up and staring and then running around here and staring and stuff. And then of course, couple that with the fact that foreigners stick out and people like to stare at them, you're gonna have just random kids that will sometimes come up. So that's a thing that I don't like. Final thing I wanna talk about in the bad side is tipping culture. Now I know there's some debate. Some people in general are opposed to tipping culture. I actually really like it. I think it incentivizes the server to want to give you good service. In China, you don't have an assigned waiter and there is no tipping. So the wait staff has basically no incentive at all to provide you with good service. In fact, one of the most famous restaurants in recent years, Haidilao, it's a hot pot chain. They are famous for their really good service. Guess what? It's basically just like normal service in a Western restaurant, okay? It's a little bit exaggerated because they provide like entertainment stuff and they provide things to do while you're waiting outside, and the staff is very helpful, but in general, other than those extra perks, the general service is just like an ordinary service in a Western restaurant as far as I'm concerned. And I think that the tipping culture has a lot to do with that. Okay, I'm not an expert about these kind of things, but I do think that the fact that the waiter doesn't have any incentive to treat you nice means that they don't tend to treat you horribly, but they just treat you pretty coldly and just want to get done and to move on to the next thing. So those are a few of the things that pop into my mind when I think about the good and the bad of Chinese restaurants. What do you think? If you're Chinese, or if you're an expat living in China, traveling in China, maybe you've noticed some similar things in Chinatowns that you've gone to. What are your thoughts? Do you have any stories? Please leave them in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please do like, please subscribe, hit the notification button, and also check in the video description for the links that you can use to support me directly. I really appreciate that. Last thing I'm gonna say is, and I made it, I kind of poked fun at myself for saying this, I think in the last video that I made, I'm really gonna make an effort to start doing regular stuff once a week. That's my goal right now. I'm really gonna try to do it. Wish me luck, and I'm gonna try to do these videos on a regular basis going forward. I'll see you in the next one. God bless.